Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr Martyn Patel and one of the newly appointed clinical associate professors here at the Norfolk and Norwich. And we are hosting a second attempt at this seminar. If those of you came along at the first attempt, remember we were Zoom bombed. We've stepped up security settings, so that's why we're authorizing people and letting them in one at a time. You've been carefully scrutinized. We're just going to give it 5 minutes to see if a few more people join. And then I'll introduce our first speaker, and we've reversed the order of the talks. John is going to go first, followed by Helen. So we'll just have 5 minutes of radio silence, and then we'll start off. It's great to see lots of familiar names joining on the Zoom Tesseract screen. Guys, as we go along, are you happy to field questions ad hoc, or would you rather people held them to the end? I tend to be happy with either approach, but I like to leave it up to the speaker. John, what would you prefer?
Yeah, maybe just wait to the end if that's
yeah, sure. Okay, I'll ask you the same question when we get to you, Helen.
So it's half an hour in total, isn't it? So I'll do what, 20 minutes?
25 minutes, yeah. When we get 25 minutes in, I'll give you a nod. And
do you want me to share my screen?
Why don't we start doing that? Yeah, that's a great idea. Is the IT going to favour us? Looks like it is. And probably just need to find the wine glass at the bottom right and click on that.
Yeah.
There you go. That looks pretty good.
Got 3 screens, so yeah, that's it. I think that's it. You're all on the same screen now.
John, I've got your handout slides. I think you need to swap screens.
Okay, hold on. Stop share.
Might just be me, but
no, probably. There's that one.
Yeah, me too, Helen.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to publish the
It's a game
spoilers.
away. Not the problem.
It's only notes on the first slide anyway. So
Is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's always good to have a dizzying grasp of your statistics.
It's still doing this.
Yeah. So, yeah, you go to that swap screens. Yeah, that one.
Okay.
Oh, perfect.
I only know because I just had to do it for mine.
Well, I reckon we are probably up to some decent numbers here. So, John, you're working over in University of Essex, I understand, and you've had a long interest in this topic. Probably much better if you, I imagine, are going to introduce a little bit about yourself in the first slide, and I'll just hand straight over to you.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, so I'm Dr. John Day. I teach on the doctorate in clinical psychology at the University of Essex, although by my training, I'm actually a sociologist, particularly interested in physical activity and health. And then I kind of did this study as my postdoc while I was working at Healthwatch Essex as the research manager. So yeah, that's me. Just a little bit about this study before we get going. So obviously I conducted it while I was working at Healthwatch Essex. The reason for doing it is because rates of obesity and overweight are now similar for men and women. Yet this is not really reflected in people who access services, with women tending to dominate. Like services, early qualitative research in the area drew predominantly on women's lived experiences, although in the past decade, studies that look at the experiences and try to explain the experiences of men have slowly increased. So yeah, the study itself, as you can see in the title of this particular report, looks at men's experiences of losing and gaining weight. That's the report. But what I'm going to do today is just talk about one chapter of the report in particular that kind of brings the data together at the end and is richest because it refers specifically to men's experiences of weight cycling. So that's a little bit about the work. What we're going to do today. So in terms of just the context and a bit of background, if we look at experiences living with obesity, gender and men, and particularly those studies that have taken place over the last 10 or so years. So what I'm going to cover here is just how nuanced and complex this area is, and just all these competing ideas that go on. So first of all, it's worth bringing up and highlighting literature that suggests that men delay seeking support when living with obesity. So to some extent, this might be explainable due to the normalisation of overweight amongst men from a certain age in particular, or stage of life, if you like. If we think about the notion of the dad bod, or being a fat dad, those ideas. So this seems to be important in relation to gender in particular. So that's really the overweight aspect. But when we think about men and women are sensitive to this social stigma associated with obesity and the label of it, men don't seem to be as affected by being classified as overweight in the same way as women are. But as a in terms of obesity specifically, there is also literature that tells us that men are conscious and do worry about the health consequences of living with obesity, anxious about this, but are more likely to wait until acting, until being borderline or actually classified as being obese rather than overweight, and reaching out to seek support. And this was kind of flagged up in my study as well, whereby a lot of the men only really tried to do anything until they were told by a medical professional that they were bordering on obesity or would be now medically classified as obese. So what's particularly interesting about the case of men, this is not to say, of course, that it's worse for men than women, but there are particular gender nuances at play. So men living with obesity, like women, find themselves implicated within this war on obesity, as it's been called by Monahan and Malson, and lots of Lee Monahan's work also refers to this in quite a lot of detail. It comes up time and time again. But unique to the experiences of men is that the potential remedy of weight management services which they're offered is predominantly a female domain. Thus, men are reluctant to attend because being transparent about their bodily shortcomings is seen as a feminine topic of conversation. And men would also have to do this, in front of a gaze and a room full of women. So, to some extent, men's fear about being turned into women as well is not only limited to this fear of attending services and being spotted at services, which is something else that men refer to as well in research. But it's already manifested in their embodiment to some extent. So again, this comes up in Lee Monahan's research. So because men predominantly gain weight in the stomach area first, some refer to when they're living with obesity as feeling a little bit like a pregnant woman, which is quite demasculizing for some men. So it's a little surprise in that sense that men have a tendency to dismiss ideas, conversations and practices pertaining to fatness as a repulsive, feminine and feminizing subject, and dismiss something that they don't need to worry about, even though we know they do through other literature. And there's this general unwillingness to open up about their concerns amongst many men, not all, but many men. So another central, common and probably unwanted aspect of living with obesity and hoping to lose weight is encountering this phenomenon of weight cycling. So, generally as a definition, what's been offered is this repetitive pattern of weight loss and regain. So weight loss, referred to as, is also the outcome, if you like, of what's referred to as yo-yo dieting. But if we come away from this general definition and think about it a little bit more critically, it's very hard to conceptualize. So we need to think about what constitutes weight cycling in terms of how much weight is lost and then gained and regained. So how much is required to constitute the idea of cycling? And if relatively small losses and gains are considered weight cycling, over what period of time does this need to occur? So that there's no real established hard and fast rules for this, but weight cycling is something that people seem to talk about often and experience. And it's not just limited to people living with obesity either. Everyone's weight can fluctuate quite quickly, and for lots of reasons as well, not just diet and physical activity. So although the type of weight loss and regain, so if we think about it, in terms of lived experience, which is what my work looks at, and particularly qualitatively, the type of weight loss and the type of weight cycling that's worth studying, if we think about the definition maybe of speaking to people who've experienced weight loss and regain in terms of this pattern of intentional weight loss and unintended or unwanted gain, because those are the people that are probably most interested and benefit most from the research in terms of there's something going on in terms of their well-being. So in this respect, weight cycling is predominantly an issue attached to well-being and self-worth. As again, contrary to popular belief, and maybe because it's so hard to define, weight cycling is yet to be clearly linked to adverse health outcomes and risks. So in particular, if we think about this qualitative aspect of well-being, the relationship between bodily transformations and identity, whereby the notion of fatness carries with it a social stigma that arguably causes more harm so it causes arguably more immediate harm than the medicalised health risks. So, people living with obesity and overweight, although it's a risk for various conditions, people can be, illness-free, if you like, while living with obesity. Whereas this thing about the well-being implications is especially because obesity and overweight is visible, it's something that's, immediately affects people. So navigating this fatness stigma while maintaining a strong sense of identity as body weight fluctuates is more complex as well than the way it's medicalised in terms of just changing people's lifestyle behaviours to encourage weight loss. However, because of the notion that fat is fixable through various methods, as we're apparently told, and weight cycling is inherently unstable and difficult to conceptualise, people who want to lose weight find themselves in a precarious position as their body projects remain, perpetually unfinished. This area that, of this way they want to look that always seems out of reach, and sometimes, they're getting towards it, other times not so much, because, this weight cycling and this weight regain in particular, that aspect, I think it affects something like 90% of people who attend weight management programs. I'm going to speak about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So again, moving away from just the idea of people living with obesity and overweight, many of us probably see our bodies as this ongoing project that we do things to. But because this is something to do with obesity, and this war on obesity is played out on a political level, there's always also this thing going on in terms of people, because it's part of public debate, people also comment quite a bit on obesity, whether they've got experience of it themselves or not, whether they're a medical professional or not. So it's also open to, as well as this gender gaze, it's also open to this public gaze and regular comment. So today, I'm going to focus on the research objective of exploring the weight loss and weight gain experiences of men living with obesity. So this was also the initial part of the interview guide when I did the study, and other areas of the study also looked at what men think about the label of obesity, and then I also looked at the masculine reluctance to engage with weight management services, which I think is quite interesting because it might be like an extreme version of men's engagement with health services more generally. So to do this, I did use BMI as a recruitment criteria, which, against everything I've just said, kind of medicalizes it a little bit. But at the same time, this also adds a layer of richness and experience, because all participants currently identified themselves as living with the label of obesity, which translates into some of the meaning evident in the data, and why the study was, I think, was particularly rich. To add further layers of meaning and variety of experience to the data, I also sought to recruit participants with a variety of weight management experiences, especially in terms of type and amount of experience. And I'm going to talk about the sample in a couple of slides' time. Participants also completed a demographic survey just for background information and to see, you know, to the extent to which these experiences might be generalizable within particular groups and across particular intersections. Participants also self-reported BMI or just self-reported their height and weight, and then I worked out that and added it to the data, what their BMI was. Altogether, I collected 20 hours, 30 minutes of qualitative data, which is audio recorded and transcribed, which actually ended up being a bigger study than my PhD, which, you know, I took quite a bit of time to analyse. So in terms of looking at the sample then, so this first figure, this looks at the breadth of the experience and the amount of the experience. So as you can see, some people have got experience in more than one area. And the reason I did this as well is because as part of like setting up the study, I spoke to commissioners, I spoke to health professionals and obesity clinicians working on the ground with people. And they tend to use a tiered system, which is essentially the system that people should go through, this obesity pathway, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and you have to fail each stage to get to the next stage. And each time it becomes obviously more clinical until you get to tier 4, where it's the bariatric surgery. So the way I actually split it up is I thought, well, you know, the distinctions in experience that people seem to have is there's 3 clear types of service, it seemed. You've got the public funded weight management services, which participants tend to refer to as being more like educational. These involved a weigh-in, but you went kind of as an individual in your own time in like a 2-hour slot, and these tended to be run by like local authorities. There's commercial weight management programs, which people could be referred to for 12 weeks as well. These were generally Weight Watchers and Slimming World. And then there was on the rise as well, and continuing to become more popular at the time I did the study, were football-based weight management programs. And these, again, this experience was quite different because it actually involved, you know, this enacted embodiment of actually doing the weight loss strategies together at the same time, rather than what some of them refer to as just talking about it. And then the other thing to note as well is because to some extent weight is something that many of us worry about, there was also, people also had experiences of individual weight loss practices. And I kind of preempted this by thinking about it and looking at the literature, because there's lots of this particularly in feminist psychology that's been written about. But I just thought, you know, this is probably going to be similar for men. It's just a case of whether they'll talk to me about it, which they did do. So I've got here, you can see, you know, those people who've tried on their own as well, independently, with things like diet, exercise, calorie count. I've got those as well. But there's also, it's also worth picking out. So Callum was quite an interesting case. He's about halfway down. So he hadn't actually attended any services. I recruited him by word of mouth because this study was advertised on social media as well. So he hadn't been to any services. He was still in the stage whereby he was just trying himself, but still experiencing weight cycling. And then Lee, again, from word of mouth, he actually hadn't tried anything. So as you can say, I mean, he was in his mid-20s, and as you can see, he's got a BMI of 58. But he hadn't actually tried to lose weight at all in any circumstance. So again, he was an interesting person to speak to understand his experience and that type of thing. Yeah, so that's it in terms of the breadth of experience. And then this is just some of the demographic characteristics of the makeup, the sample. So as you can see, it's quite well spread in terms of all the different areas apart from ethnicity. As you can see, it's predominantly a white British sample, but then again, that's a real issue in terms of services, and I predominantly use services to recruit the participants, so that's probably why that happened. Yeah, so I mean, I reflect on the conclusion in the report about how, you know, a future study might look predominantly at minoritized ethnic groups and racialized groups in particular, because they're the group that seem to be who seems to, you know, engage with services the least amongst men in particular. So that'd be an interesting intersectional study to do further down the line. I also collected the majority of, well, all of the data just following the outbreak of COVID-19. So I actually got set up to do the study like a week after Boris Johnson announced the first lockdown. So I had to wait a little bit until I collected data. But what was interesting about this is in terms of the demographics, in terms of occupation, it's worth noting that some of these people are actually on furlough, and then eventually that those who stayed in touch and they did actually lose their jobs. But I just went on, you know, that if they were furloughed from their job, I went on their occupation as it was, you know, in terms of where they've been furloughed from. So that's that. And as you can see, hopefully they'll you know, these findings are transferable or generalizable. That, you know, some people argue qualitative research is across the different areas such as age, disability, socioeconomic status. And then this is just something that you might be interested in, because obviously we're, you know, the seminars based in the east of England and studies took place in the east of England. So I got the first line of people's postcode. So I think there's people from Saffron Walden, Chelmsford, Colchester, Ipswich. The Romford postcode is Thurrock, Southend, and then also a little bit of information about whether people lived in urban or rural areas. So to analyse the data, I'm not sure how many people would be interested in this, given I imagine it's largely a medical audience. So I used Gadamer's hermeneutics about interpretations pertinent to the fusion of horizon. So he argues that you know, too often researchers just go away and, you know, take people's data and do their own thing with it, and it's the research interpretation that matters the most. Whereas Gadamer argues that it's actually that there's all these different contexts that recur, and it's important that you take them all together as a collective. So these are the types of things I took into account, as well, of course, my interview transcripts. So I also, you know, took into account the ethnographic conversations I had when setting up, you know, the service, which wasn't, it's setting up the study, sorry, which wasn't, you know, data collection as such. It was just trying to understand the context. So I you know, I didn't record this, but I took a few notes. Then you've got my interview transcripts, which looked at all these, you know, different things and were coded accordingly. And then of course there's policy documents and it's public gaze. So, you know, one commissioner we spoke to in terms of the ethnographic conversation, spoke to someone else, and then we got an invite to the all-party parliamentary group on obesity, which again was interesting for informing our analysis. And it's important to be reflexive about that, I think, and understand that, you know, researchers are human too. And then of course my conversations with service providers and commissioners as well. Yeah, so today's focus. So when looking at this, the thing that really came out from the data in terms of weight cycling was the contexts. So I'm going to talk about the practice and context often associated with weight cycling as people reported them by men during their experience of attempting to lose weight. So there's a strong focus on the prevalence of weight cycling amongst men who attended commercial weight management programs after initially implementing individual weight loss strategies. So yeah, I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about those because there seemed to be a clear pathway here whereby men tried, you know, by themselves first and then moved on to services. And weight cycling was particularly prominent amongst and continued amongst those who went to commercial weight management programs. And then just at the end, I'll just go through the implications for weight management, service provision and pathway. So in terms of the data then, so this is the men's experiences generally of attempting to lose weight on their own, if you like. So individual weight loss practices, which included things like, you know, what they referred to now as fad diets, trying to do a little bit of physical activity, those types of things. So initially, there was rapid weight loss, as you might expect, and I think this is well documented and well understood. So yeah, over time it seemed that then this was unsustainable. So, you know, I've done the Atkins diet, lost 2 stone. So this is the weight loss aspect of the weight cycling. The weight came up like a balloon, really came up very fast. And then in the long term, it seems to be unsustainable. Whereas, you know, I've tried to slim fast, but they're not sustainable. The weight flies back on. If I'm honest, while I was doing it, I wasn't really feeling all that well. So there was more than one participant referred to doing a particular diet, such as Atkins diet, where they struggled to pass urine and go to the toilet. And when they did, it hurt, and they said it smelled funny. It was also unsustainable in terms of the social environment and family, whereby it involved them having a different meal to the rest of the family, which proved difficult. And then there was also this masculine independence and avoidance of support, and you know, it wasn't the case that men had tried a diet, it'd be unsustainable, and then they go and seek support. They'd cycle through this process of going between the diet and coming to the conclusion that it was unsustainable, because of this, maybe this idea of masculine independence and avoidance of support initially. And you see these programs where people are made to look silly when they haven't lost weight. For that reason, I've never gone along. I'm a typical male and thinking that I can do it all by myself. This person also was given the offer of support during COVID via a phone call, but turned it down. So yeah, following on from these experiences, eventually, regardless of, you know, how many times they went through this, you know, trying this diet, oh, it's not sustainable, you know, going running for a bit and then not being able to maintain the lifestyle change. Eventually, most men, apart from the one I mentioned in the sample already, went and did something else and accessed a different type of support. So in a way, although this didn't work out, it did actually eventually prompt men after a period of time to go and seek support. So there might be something in this long term, even though the weight loss outcomes weren't there. So now I'm going to refer specifically to those men who went from their experiences of individual strategies to going to commercial weight management programs. What was interesting about this in terms of...
John, just to give you a 5-minute heads up before we hit questions. No worries.
Well, yeah. So men referred to how it seemed to be like a diet dressed as a service. So although they thought they go on for help, you know, they got some help, but you know, this person in particular, Harry, had tried various times the commercial weight management program as well, and it just, you know, it hadn't changed over the 10-year period that he tried to engage with it, and continually dropped out and experienced weight cycling. So in this respect, although, you know, they've gone to get help and they get some support, men kind of saw, you know, this is still a diet, because I think with commercial weight management services, there's an aspect as well whereby the consultants have got this dual job of, in one respect, helping people, but also selling a service and selling a product. Another thing that men felt contributed to weight cycling as a consequence of attending commercial weight management programs, lack of expertise amongst the consultants. You know, to be a weight management consultant, so the commercial weight management program, you don't have to be qualified. You might do their own little course, but it's not, you know, seen as a gold standard of being a dietitian in any shape or form. And again, because the advice seemed to be the same, and they didn't know any more, you know, weight cycling became more of a problem. And then just generally, men saw that the pressure to lose weight at commercial weight management programs was just too intense. And then especially having to go up and stand up in front of people and, you know, be told that you've either, you know, done really well because you've lost weight, or done badly because you've put on weight. It was really seen as like a really impersonal experience. So in terms of thinking about this, because the real issue here seems to be weight regain, that services need to incorporate more into what they offer. So as we already spoke about at the start, you know, men are already in this unsettled position, like women might be, because they're living with obesity, but men seem to have to pluck up like courage to go along because of the feminine dominated space. So they've already got this unsettled identity whereby, you know, they're maybe thinking they're engaging in more of a feminine practice, as well as living with obesity. And that there was, you know, quite some harrowing stories. You know, I got to that point where I put on 2 pounds, been on holiday. So that was it. He didn't want to go back because he knew he'd put on weight, and that was it. He never went back again. And this participant in particular lost 3 stone and then eventually put more than 3 stone back on. This referred to, you know, the what could be sometimes quite an intense atmosphere. And Frank referred to how the women seemed to stab each other in the back. So he went along once, saw this, and again didn't go back. So in terms of the take-home messages then, so weight cycling seems to be most often referred to by the men in connection with individual weight loss practices and then commercial weight management programs. While individual practices resulted in weight regain, such experience did serve as a prompt for most men to then access services. But for those men who then went to commercial weight management programs rather than public funded or football based, weight cycling continued, but in a manner that seemed to be more harmful to men's sense of self-worth, sparking and cementing fears that they would never be able to achieve their desired long-term weight loss. So it's almost like some of these men are in a position, in terms of their well-being, then they're worse off than when they started. They've gone along to a service for some help, and they've just experienced weight cycling again, and now where do they go? Because with services as well that people are referred to for free, it depends on which postcode area you live in terms of what you can access. So implications for service provision. There seems to be a masculine independence and female dominated arena of commercial weight management programs. There seems to be this constraint for initially accessing and sustaining service engagement for men. And while the initial motivation to lose weight is shared by both commercial weight management programs and those living with obesity, once this motivation shifts to the avoidance of weight regain amongst service users, commercial weight management programs are still talking about how they shouldn't have maybe put on weight in the first place. So I think it would really develop services if people could think about this in advance, because it seems to happen time and time again. Psychologically preparing people for weight regain could be really important, because it's not just clearly all about weight loss, it's about the person as well as people dropping out. There seems to be people stuck in commercial weight management programs, continually weight cycling, not just men, probably women as well, and no alternative options to support, because it's very much based on where you live. And of course, even if you've got an eating disorder, for some people that's undiagnosed, you can't go straight to tier 3 because you have to fail tier 1 and tier 2 first. And that's just a bit about that in terms of how how we might need to rethink this tier. And this is something as well that some of the clinical psychologists I spoke to when setting up the study, they were just like, probably 8 out of 10 people I see after they've already failed tier 1 and tier 2, but really when they refer to their history with food, that they actually had an eating disorder that was undiagnosed before engaging with tier 1 and tier 2, but by engaging with those services, particularly things like Slimming World, whereby it further emotionalizes people's relationship with food by referring to the idea of sins and sinful eating. It's not going to put people in a better position by the time they get to tier 3. So we might need to rethink that, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. That's great. Sorry for the camera moves. My office colleague's come in and needs to use his computer, so I've had to raise my camera threshold to avoid any breaches of confidentiality there. There you go. Okay. That's the NHS for you, 3 to an office. So something that sprang to mind that you mentioned about ethnicity and how that may affect people's perceived engagement with weight management services, with the surname Patel and coming from a family where central obesity is something I've seen in the older generation. Is that something you think that might need to be targeted differently? Yeah, absolutely. But how you, so we need to do more research in the area, but how you actually recruit participants, who are both willing to talk to you about living with obesity, and then be from that background to, so I went along all the services I engage with, that I've mentioned, public funded, football based. I went along to some of them because some of them shifted online as well, and I spoke at the start just 5 minutes before they did the session, and of course on Zoom as well I can see who people are, and there was one person from an ethnic minority, one man, across all these services that I engage with. I must engage with 8 or 9 services, and at some services I went along to 3 or 4 different sessions. So yeah, it's really poorly understood, but like you say, there seems to be a trend whereby people from certain ethnic backgrounds are more likely to develop and live with obesity. But we need to understand that better, because I think there's a whole thing that policy needs to develop around that as well, rather than just carrying on as it is. I'll ask one more question whilst waiting to see if anyone else has a question for you. Either type it in the chat and I'll read it out, or just raise a hand in the Zoom world as it is. So you mentioned a bit about occupation and how you collected data on occupation, and a large number of the people in the study ended up being furloughed. Yeah. Do you think there's a link between sort of sedentary occupational lifestyles and obesity? Although are all of us now having sedentary occupational lifestyles?
Yeah, and that was quite interesting in the respect that there was a link with this as well, which I was right about in the report more generally that I didn't touch on, say, in terms of across the life course, and work was quite important. So it was not just, you could see it within particular socioeconomic groups as well, whereby when people got promoted and to more management and desk-based positions, particularly those who worked in like labouring jobs and so on, and for construction firms, you know, that increased their BMI basically, and they were quite open in terms of talking about that. But because again, there's this masculinity thing about, you know, being a provider and a particular life stage, becoming a father and earning money maybe, then yeah, there was something going on in terms of socioeconomic status and sedentariness. But I think it was both across the whole socioeconomic status, definitely, but then again across the life course within each socioeconomic group as well, with people getting promoted. And it just seems that, you know, those higher level, more executive jobs are more sedentary.
So I can't see any hands raised, and you seem to be escaping from the interrogation by audience that normally happens. I'll just give everyone 1 minute to declare an interest, or we shall move on. But thanks ever so much, not just for giving a great talk, but being ever so kind to rearrange and come back to us for a second bite step. Amanda Howard's got a hand up. Would you like to ask a question, Amanda?
Hi, sorry, I got cut off, so I was a bit late putting my question in because I had to rejoin, but thank you very much for that really interesting and thought-provoking discussion. I guess my reflection, having lived through a generation where the book Fat is a Feminist Issue was published, and you mentioned the feminist debate, John, yeah. I just wondered, you know, in another way, I'm used to the sort of double lens, and I think there's some good discussion at the moment about diagnoses. I'm a GP by background and an academic, and you know, Helen and I, who's coming on next, were talking this morning about autism and the fact that women have not much been diagnosed with autism, and that may be a bias as well. So I think but then Fat is a Feminist Issue very much had the lens about socioeconomic determinants of health.
Yeah.
And, you know, in a sense, I think whether you're a fat man or a thin man or a fat woman or a thin woman, you know, a lot of stuff is about the junk food culture and exercise opportunities and, you know, how and there seems to be a lot of victim blaming to me at the moment. Yeah. It's a lot of, and as a GP, I always had to be really careful because obviously you want to help individuals to take control over their lives and find ways that they think are appropriate to change things that matter with their health.
Yeah.
But in another way, there's all that upstream stuff. And I wondered whether many of your sample were actually saying, hey, look, you know, I live in a 1-bedroom flat with 3 kids and the only food I can afford is the junk food place around the corner. Did you have much debate about that?
Yeah, to some extent, and it's just like, it's, you know, in some ways the study's controversial in that respect, in that, you know, I'm expecting people to open up to me and talk about, you know, these varied experiences, but like you say, in some circumstances it was just very simple and like, you know, I can't afford this, I'm in this position, in this circumstance whereby I can't do anything about that. But I think then there is still, you know, room to include those experiences and go back to services and say, look, this is, you know, these are people's lives. Something needs to be done because, you know, I don't think the services are really suitable for anyone really, especially that tiered system is the thing for me.
But I agree. I think, you know, the NHS even, you know, it's got a big scope, but actually some of the stuff that needs to be changed is outside and we've got to advocate at that level. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.
No worries. Yeah,
thanks, John.
In terms of the poverty in particular, where it came up was not so much people's poverty now, although that was really important anyway. It was more people were stuck because of their childhood socialization. So there was a few men who referred to how their mum in particular was in an abusive relationship with a partner who wasn't their dad. And then they you know, when he was coming around basically and they knew she was going to get beaten up, she put the children all in a room with some food And of course, they can hear what's going on, and then they associate food with that emotional distress for the rest of their lives. Yeah.
Okay. Well, John, again, thanks ever so much. You're welcome to stay and listen to Helen's talk as we move on, but I know
Stay
you've
for as
got
long as I can,
a commitment just after 1. So Helen, over to you to start screen sharing. And you need no introduction, Helen, as a local girl, an integral part of Norwich Medical School. And we're all very much looking forward to this talk. So yeah, I can see your slides. You just need to go into presenter view, and yeah.
Am I the right way around? So can you see my secret stuff, or can you see the actual stuff?
I cannot see any secret stuff. Very disappointing.
There's not much secret stuff, actually.
You'll have to share along.
And John's already heard this as well, because last time I think we almost got to the end of me before we got Zoom bombed. But thank you very much for arranging for us to come back. Another opportunity to talk a little bit more about my favourite subject, really. So my talk's about bariatric surgery in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. I've called it pros and cons, but it's actually about the benefits and some of the long-term issues. And it's really around the long-term issues that my interest lies, both clinically and from an academic point of view. So just a brief intro to me. So as Martyn says, I'm a clinical associate professor at UEN, GP by background. I'm also currently on the NIHA committee and on the British Obesity and Metabolic Surgery Society, which is BOMS for short, Council, which is basically the National Society for Bariatric Surgery in the UK. Bariatric surgery. I'm not going to go through a whole lot of epidemiology, so I think everybody's really very aware of the issues we have around obesity, both in the UK and worldwide at the moment. But in the UK, we have around 1 in 25 adults currently living with severe obesity. And by that, what I mean is somebody with a BMI over 40. And for those people, bariatric surgery is actually the most clinically and cost-effective treatment we have at the moment. There have been some very recent advances with medications, which are showing actually pretty good weight loss. But still, at the moment, bariatric surgery is the most effective one we have for people. So in the UK, there are 3 main procedures that are carried out. So again, there are some newer procedures which are starting to be done, but the numbers are relatively low at the moment. So I'll focus on the ones which you'll see more people with. The oldest of them is a gastric band, which is quite often what people refer to when they talk about bariatric surgery. But actually, as I said, it's an older procedure and it's not done as commonly nowadays because it's not as effective as the other 2 procedures. And because the way it works, it can be quite difficult to get the fit exactly right for people. So how this works is basically there's a silicone band that just goes around the proximal stomach. And attached to that is a little port that goes under the skin. And that band gets filled with water to tighten it or defill to loosen it. And it's that adjustment that can be quite difficult to get right for patients. Historically, people thought this works basically by restricting your stomach contents, but actually what we know is that band actually compresses on the gastric wall, obviously, and that puts pressure on vagal afferent nerve endings, which then send a signal to your hypothalamus to tell you that you're full, so it works on satiety. The other 2 procedures are Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, or gastric bypass for short, and a sleeve gastrectomy. Sometimes called a gastric sleeve. These are the ones which are done much more commonly at the moment. The gastric bypass, I think, is still done more than the sleeve, because that's basically the sleeve is a slightly newer procedure, but they're pretty much the most common ones. So the gastric bypass sort of does what it says on the tin. It literally bypasses a portion of your stomach and your small intestine. So what happens with this is a small pouch is made of your proximal stomach. It's about 30 mils. And I try and say, it's always struggle to say, but an anastomosis is made with the jejunum. And then the second anastomosis is made a jejunal anastomosis lower down. So you bypass a big portion of the stomach, the duodenum, and some of the jejunum. Then with the sleeve gastrectomy, basically with that, a portion of the stomach is removed. So you're left with a sort of banana-shaped stomach remnant. And the way these work, so again, these were thought of as malabsorptive procedures, and they are to a certain degree, as well as restrictive. But what we know now is actually these mainly work on changing your gut hormones. And again, it signals to your brain around your appetite control. So they increase appetite suppressing signals from PYY and GLP-1, and they decrease appetite stimulating signals from ghrelin. And just as a note, the new medications which are out, they work on GLP-1 as well. So that's a real target at the moment for weight loss management. There are other mechanisms that are thought to be involved, for example, around gut microbiota and bile acids, but the main mechanism is thought to be through those gut hormones. So this has already been mentioned by John. This is our lovely tier system we have in England at the moment, and he's quite right, there are lots of issues with it, but it is what we've got. So at the bottom you have sort of the population level, which I think John was talking about to a certain degree, the tier 1. Then tier 2 is more what John was talking about, so that includes your commercial weight management programs. Tier 3 is specialist management, so that's basically an MDT type approach and more individual one-to-one. And then right at the top is where bariatric surgery lies. So basically it gets more specialized, and again, as John said, more medicalized as you go further up. And generally speaking, at the moment, you do have to go through one to get to the next one, and that's where some of the issues lie. So for example, for tier 4 bariatric surgery, people actually have to go through tier 3 first of all to be able to be referred for bariatric surgery. And generally speaking, it's a year in tier 3 that people are required to do, apart from a few exceptions, which I'll mention on the next slide. So you have a strange situation. So for example, if I want to refer somebody for bariatric surgery to GP, I actually refer them to a tier 3 service, who, if that tier 3 service then doesn't work in the same location with the tier 4 service, they then have to write back to me as a GP and ask me to then refer the patient to tier 4. So there's quite a lot of issues with this. So who can we actually refer for bariatric surgery? So people with a BMI over 40, because as I said, these are the people we know where it's very effective. Also people with a lower BMI, but with a significant disease that could be improved by weight loss. And the examples are usually given are very much cardiovascular, diabetes, but actually there's a huge number of diseases that can be improved by weight loss. And I'll be going through some of the benefits of bariatric surgery. You can see the range there. So personally, when I'm referring, I have quite an open mind for that categorization. For people with a BMI over 50, it's actually supposed to be considered as a first-line option, which means they don't necessarily have had to try something else before you can refer them for consideration. For those people, I could refer straight over to tier 3 with a view for bariatric surgery. The group I was going to mention where they can do a slightly shorter time in tier 3 are people with a BMI over 35 and recent onset type 2 diabetes. And this comes really because of the effect on type 2 diabetes, which again, I'll talk a little bit about later, from bariatric surgery. So those people could be expedited, which tends to mean they can do around 6 months in tier 3 rather than the full year. Also, people with recent onset type 2 diabetes, you can potentially refer them at a lower BMI between 30 and 34.9. That's just for consideration. So it's a less strong recommendation from NICE on that one. And just a reminder that people of non-white family origins need to be referred at lower BMI thresholds. It's usually about 2.5 BMI points, I suppose you'd call it, lower than they are for the white population. In terms of the number of procedures we're doing in the UK, not great, to be honest. We do around 6,000. This is pre-pandemic. Obviously, it has dropped post-pandemic. It is beginning to pick up a bit. But nevertheless, it is way below what you would think should be happening, given the number of people we have potentially eligible for this management and how effective it can be for people. So I think it's around 1 or 2%, I think, of people who are actually eligible who have bariatric surgery. Now, obviously, not everybody who's eligible will necessarily want bariatric surgery, but the point is really that they should have a conversation about it and be offered it. And I think a large proportion of them we're currently doing at the moment would probably say yes and be appropriate, obviously from an anaesthetic point of view and so on. So in terms of the benefits of why would you want to refer somebody and suggest it to a patient? So the thing people always think about, obviously, with bariatric surgery and weight management is weight loss. So for these procedures, with the gastric banding, people on average will lose around 20% total body weight. With the other two, it's a bit higher, it's 20 to 30% total body weight. So they're very good weight losses, and they're higher than any other options we have at the moment. The most recent medications that have come up which is one called semaglutide. With that, people are losing around 20%, so that's actually coming close. So that's really exciting actually for the future to give people more options. But at the moment, this is the best options people have. There are some people who don't lose weight so well, and we don't really understand, I don't think, at the moment why that happens. It's also pretty safe. The mortality rate is similar to having your gallbladder out. It's usually keyhole surgery, and you're out sort of a day or so after surgery. There are a few units who are trialing doing it as a day procedure as well. The other thing with the weight loss from bariatric surgery is actually a really important point, is the fact it's a sustained weight loss. So everything that John was just talking about with weight cycling, with almost every other weight management option we have at the moment for people, they might lose weight, but a huge proportion and the huge majority will regain. And when people regain, they tend to actually go higher than they were at their starting weight. And we now know that that's due to changes in resting energy expenditure and changes in gut hormone profiles, which tend to make people feel more hungry after they've lost weight. With bariatric surgery, that's different. There is a little bit of weight plateauing. There can be some weight regain. And again, there are some people who actually regain quite a bit more. But on average, people do tend to keep a good, significant weight loss. And this is data from something called the Swedish obesity study. It's been running for years and years and years. So this is 20 years data, and people are still staying in that significant weight loss, which obviously has significant health benefits, both in stopping progression of comorbidities and hopefully preventing development of some. And obviously that has cost savings benefits as well for healthcare systems potentially. So in terms of the types of conditions that can be helped from bariatric surgery, as I said, it's almost anything, but it does cover every system in the body. So there's respiratory conditions, so sleep apnea. People are always screened for sleep apnea when they go to tier 3 services. Obviously your cardiovascular health. There's recently been some studies on non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and idiopathic intracranial hypertension. There is evidence that certain cancers' mortality can be reduced. There's benefits in both functional ability and musculoskeletal problems like osteoarthritis, and importantly, obviously, diabetes, as well as fertility and conditions like polycystic ovarian syndrome. So those are benefits. And just to give you a bit more of an idea, sort of the sort of numbers, really, this again is from that Swedish obesity study. From that, the reduction in all-cause mortality for people who've had bariatric surgery, and this is compared to usual care, there's a 30% reduction, with cardiovascular mortality of similar, cancer mortality more around 23%, and the adjusted mean life expectancy was also longer for people who had surgeries and comparators, but still shorter than the general population. And then just a few more sort of specific examples that I think are quite important ones. One of the main ones, as I've mentioned already, is type 2 diabetes. So around 70% of people with type 2 diabetes pre-surgery will go into remission, and usually it's pretty within days of surgery. And by that, is the definition of remission is a little bit variable, but generally speaking, it's thought to be not needing any medications and HbA1c in the normal range. People do need to follow up. They're not cured, but they are in remission. Obviously, that has huge health benefits. And that's why those referral criteria for people with recent diagnosis of diabetes is different. As I mentioned, there is some reduction in cancer incidence, and particularly in women. So it's much stronger in women than it is in men. So the adjusted hazard ratio is about 0.71. And then during COVID, some work was done, as it wasn't always everything, but again, on the benefits of bariatric surgery, and this is in comparison to, again, usual care. And again, there was really quite significant changes to hazard ratios for those. So that's sort of all the positive sides. So what I'm going to talk about the rest of my talk today is around sort of longer term considerations, and that's where there's some issues that I personally feel we need to address in the care that people are receiving. So this is what I've covered so far. So I said all the benefits of surgery, but there are long-term issues that people can have and need continued support to manage. And this is just some examples of them. So there's multiple psychological issues people can have. For some, that's around alcohol and substance use. There's a lot of issues around body image. People's literally their body changes hugely, they don't recognize themselves. There can be eating behavior issues that, if they're not resolved pre-surgery, can continue or develop new eating behavior issues. As I mentioned, some people can regain. People's comorbidities do need to be monitored, usually because they're improving, but nevertheless they need to be monitored. And some people will develop complications, for example, something called dumping syndrome, which is basically where people have hypoglycemic episodes after a meal that's high in sugar. And that tends to be with the bypass or the sleeve. People can develop food intolerances, ulcers, internal hernias, and these are not common, but they can happen. And the other big one is nutritional deficiencies, and that's where much of my work has been more focused. Again, quite common, but for some people it can become much more serious. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the slide. So some examples, I'm just going to put all these on the slide. So these are examples in the literature of conditions that people develop through nutritional deficiencies developed post-bariatric surgery. You can see there's quite a range of deficiencies that people can develop, and some of them are not ones that I as a GP would see commonly, so copper, selenium, and those sorts of things. And they can lead to, like I say, quite significant problems for people. So things like peripheral neuropathy. There have been some examples of fetal hemorrhages with mothers who are low in vitamin K, unfortunately. Myelopathies, there's quite a lot of eye problems that people can develop, particularly night blindness for people who have vitamin A deficiency, which some people becomes permanent, and cardiomyopathies due to selenium deficiencies. At the moment, we're actually in the middle of, well, almost at the end of doing a rapid review of these case reports. So these are sort of the results we've got so far. This has been done with an elective student in one of our GPACFs. And we're looking at people who are longer term, so at least 2 years post-surgery. And on those, the main deficiencies that are coming up at the moment are vitamin A, vitamin D, and copper. But as you can see, we're seeing very much those sorts of issues that are developing. And for example, with vitamin A, there are 3 cases where people did maintain a visual loss post-deficiency. We're also looking at the factors that might have led to those deficiencies in this review. And I think they're not hugely surprising, to be honest, but patient factors are things such as non-adherence to supplements, being lost to follow-up, and generally poor oral nutrition. Whereas the healthcare factors think are very much about education of healthcare professionals, so misdiagnosis, delayed diagnosis, and missed opportunities. So it does show that there is some work to be done there, potentially. So I've just obviously explained some of the issues post-surgery, and we do have guidance that tells us what care people should have post-surgery, which is again from NICE in the UK at the moment. And that does say that people should stay under the specialist service for 2 years post-surgery. And then after that, they should be discharged back to GPs, but continue to have annual monitoring, particularly around nutritional status. And that should be in a shared care model, preferably with a tier 3 service available, if not an appropriate alternative. And the reason that's been put in there is because the tier 3 coverage in the UK is not universal. So there needs to be another option for people who unfortunately don't have tier 3 services locally. So that's what's supposed to happen. And we also have guidance in the UK from BOMS, the council that I'm on, and I co-led this work, which goes through both actually pre and post nutritional guidance. It was updated in 2020, quite a large document, but we're currently working on the GP version and the patient version, hopefully. But this goes through exactly what is advised for people to have in terms of supplements and also in the blood tests. So just to give you an example, people who have had a gastric bypass, sleeve gastrectomy, and this is lifelong, should have a multivitamin and mineral supplement. They should have 3 monthly vitamin B12 injections. They should be having calcium, vitamin D, and iron. Whereas people with gastric band only really need multivitamin and mineral supplements, but they do still get other deficiencies sometimes, so you have to be a little bit careful with that. Unfortunately, we do know that follow-up attendance can be poor, and there has been some work with basically surveys with patients as to reasons why this is. And the reasons that come up from those surveys, again, I don't think are a surprise, and I think you find a common to many other health problems. But distance to appointments, and that really links into that issue around the coverage of tier 3 services and also tier 4. You know, often people have to travel a couple of hours to get to a tier 4 service. Financial constraints, and again, that could be time off work to go to an appointment, or actually purely the travel cost, or cost of medications depending on where they are. Lack of comorbidity deficiencies, which I think is something we see quite commonly with people where they don't actually have symptoms, they're not really getting any benefit from taking things as all preventative. Medication side effects, and just not really understanding the importance of why they need to take their medications was also reported. Forgetting to take the medications, again, not an uncommon problem. And GPs not prescribing supplements, and that can be an issue because in some areas there's basic guidance from what used to be CCGs around vitamin supplements, and that hasn't really been changed for this particular cohort of patients. And it was suggested that patient GP education may help the situation. So that was sort of from surveys, but wasn't, you know, particularly in depth. So we actually, it's now 4 years ago, time flies, conducted a qualitative.
Talking of time, Helen, that's your 5-minute warning. There you go.
Okay. In 2018, looking at patients' experiences of long-term follow-up. And again, this is looking at the longer-term follow-up, so post discharge from specialist services, and we conducted thematic analysis. I'm not going to go through all the data because there's a lot, but just to pick out a few main points. I'm going to have to go really fast, I've obviously waffled too long on the way. But one of the main issues around access, so people actually really wanted patient-led access, some people did, and really valued that, whereas others actually really valued having routine appointments and that accountability, and they found that really helped. Plastic surgery and access to it was something that came up in a lot of the studies, and people find it really very stressful and felt they needed to beg and implore to get access. So in the UK, this is all around excess skin that people can develop post-surgery. It's not covered under the NHS, so people want surgery for that, they have to pay for it privately. And that's the same in other countries as well. Patients felt quite frustrated about seeing people who they felt didn't really understand their condition properly, and worryingly that actually ended up with them almost giving up and avoiding healthcare contacts, both related to obesity and more widely, which again is a concern obviously for their healthcare more generally. And the last bit really is around when the care was delivered. So in the first 18 to 24 months, people described feeling wonderful, basically. They described the honeymoon period, feeling very confident, everything's wonderful because the weight's just dropping off. Then after that was a real coming down to reality and everything going to custard. And that coincides with that 2-year cutoff where people are then discharged back to GPs and have less support. And that tailing off of appointments led to people feeling very abandoned and disempowered, unfortunately. So again, something else to look at. I'm going to skip over that one. So overall, people felt that it was a real roller coaster and they weren't in control, and that was really very frightening for them. So it's clear that patients want more support than they're getting at the moment. When we look at GP attitudes, there's actually very little data out there. Again, there's just some survey data, but altogether that survey data all shows that GPs at the moment don't feel comfortable with managing these types of patients or confident from different aspects. So really, despite the fact that GPs are given a central role in caring for these patients long term, they're not confident and they don't feel they have the competency to do so. And in some studies, actually, these concerns about being able to follow up these patients properly actually led to barriers to people actually referring people for bariatric surgery in the first place. So we've got this situation where we've got people we've got guidance where people are supposed to be having lifelong follow-up, but we don't have services for that. We don't have training of GPs for that. And so at the moment, there's a lot of worries that people aren't having it. Just to say that there's also European and US guidance that also say that people should have lifelong follow-up. So it's very much is as suggested, and there's good concordance, and that's what people should be having. We did do some work with the RCGP and BOMS to try and help support GPs a while ago, and also with NHS England, but again, there's still this concern that people aren't getting the care. So again, I'm going to skip over that. So we've, this is the last bit, very recently have conducted a retrospective cohort study, and that was based on routine GP data from the IMRD database. And that was looking at people who'd had bariatric surgery, just adults, and were at least 3 years post-surgery, and looking at the proportion of those who basically had recommended blood tests and nutritional supplements according to BOM's guidance. I'm just going to very quickly show the gastric bypass data from that study. We did look at all 3 procedures, but I'll just show you the gastric bypass. Again, I'm going to skip over that one. So we had over 3,000 patients in total in the cohort, but around 1,000 of those had a bypass, and this is the data for blood tests people had, and also weights. And the really key point from this is that none of them are 100%, which is what it should be if they're all having to follow up as advised. And the ones which are higher up are ones which are based on routine bloods, which we do in general practice for lots of other reasons, and these may not have been anything to do with somebody having had bariatric surgery. And the ones which are more related to bariatric surgery, like copper and zinc, were really very low percentages, in sort of 1 to 5%, which are probably more representative of a bariatric surgery review per se. The supplement prescriptions were a bit better, but still around 50% at best. And the last bit to say is that we did also look at the people who had a blood test, if they actually had deficiency, and we found there were deficiencies. For example, anemia, which is the highest percentage, about 50% of people were anemic. So if you consider then that there are people who haven't had a blood test, and 50% of them are looking at this may very well be have anemia as well, there's a proportion of people who are undiagnosed out there. So in summary, bariatric surgery at the moment is our most clinically and cost-effective treatment for people with severe obesity, particularly at least sustained weight loss, and there's multiple benefits to health and well-being. But currently we're not using it enough as we possibly could be, and we really need to work on the long-term follow-up care and support. And then that's just some thanks to the people who are involved in the work I've talked about and funders. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Helen. As ever, I'm ready with a question whilst we let other people type their questions in the chat or put a hand up to unmute. So the thing I remember from this talk, because we did get quite a way into it last time round, was how horrifying and scary it is that people's vitamin levels go uncorrected, potentially drop off a cliff, because there can be some major health implications of running out of B12, etc. And how do we combat that? Do we make the patient the expert? Do we give them the information and say, you must demand to see your GP and make sure you're on these every so often? What do you think the answer is?
It's really difficult, and I'm hoping to start some work looking at it, with any luck. But it's a really complex area, because so there are thoughts about, yes, patients could become the expert, but actually some of these patients are really quite complex, and there's a question about whether that's appropriate and that's too much to ask of patients. But I think there's probably going to need to be an element of that, because there isn't really the capacity in the specialist services to keep all patients under them, or the funding. And then there's also issues in general practice with the fact that we don't really have the trained expertise to care for patients. So like I say, it's very difficult. It's not a simple one, so not a simple answer, I'm afraid, either. But it is a worry, a real worry.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions to the audience. I don't know whose hand out first, but always go with the boss. So Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. Lovely talk, Helen. I know we've talked about this in the past, but I'm just wondering, is there any update? The Lancet Commission report in 2020 identified midlife obesity as the major determinant of dementia risk later in life. Has there been kind of any research on the kind of long-term cognitive trajectory of bariatric surgery patients, and does it improve cognitive function later in life, or do we know?
So I think I'm not a great expert in this area, is the first thing to say, particularly around dementia. But there has been some work that's looked at cognition. I think there is some evidence that it improves cognition. But actually, I'm just been meeting with Michael Hornberger and one of my bariatric surgery colleagues down in Bristol, and we're just starting to work up possibly some pilot work looking at that. So I think it's a really potentially really interesting area. I mean, if it showed improvements in terms of those sorts of outcomes, I mean, that'd be amazing.
I think it would be a great motivator, I think, for putting
absolutely
increased clinical resource into it. I would.
Yeah, but yeah.
Thanks,
Time
Helen.
will tell.
Thank you.
Nick, I think you're next if you want to ask a question.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, just get the video on. There we go. Yeah, thanks, Helen. That was really good. Really enjoyed that talk. Fascinating stuff. So I've got two questions. I'll start with one and then shut up. And then if I get a chance, I'll come back with the other one, Martin, if that's all right.
Okay, sure.
But the first question is about outcomes. It's about well-being and psychological outcomes. And I thought on the way through you hadn't mentioned well-being, and then at the end you said there was good evidence for long-term well-being. But you talked about 50% risk of anemia, people feeling it had all gone to custard and that they've been abandoned, problems with nutritional deficiencies, high rates of depression. So it seems to be kind of not compatible with high well-being outcomes. And I wondered what the research was, given that it's clearly effective in terms of weight loss, but is it effective in terms of people feeling better? Are they kind of, have they got a lower BMI and feel dreadful and wish they hadn't had it? Or, is there, how strong is the evidence on well-being and gastric surgery?
So I probably slightly misspoke on that one. So there has, as far as I'm aware, I think there is some work on quality of life and well-being, but I think it's quite variable in honesty in the outcomes. So it's not, consistently everything's wonderful. And I think, so most of the research in bariatric surgery is cohort data. There aren't many RCTs. There's a big one called the Biband sleeve, which is I think it's the biggest RCT in the world and longest that's running in the UK, and that's just coming to an end. And they are looking at quality of life and well-being in that. So we'll hopefully imminently have some better data from that. So I wouldn't ever say it was strong evidence. And certainly from talking to patients, it's very variable. So there are some people with, for example, the excess skin, who will say, and also this is also in literature from the qualitative synthesis I did and other qualitative studies, where people quite clearly say that actually they preferred their body as it was to how it looks with the excess skin. And actually they feel they're worse off. There is evidence that there's a high rate of divorce post-surgery. There's also a high rate of suicide post-surgery. So it's not all a bed of roses. So yeah, so the data is not great, but hopefully we'll have some better data imminently. The answer to the question.
Where are we with shared decision making? Is that, do people get enough information that they need this long-term follow-up? They're going to have high risks of all the side effects and likely to have psychological problems.
So I think in tier 3 services, generally speaking, what happens is people have education sessions around bariatric surgery during that year. They're quite often group sessions that get given a lot of information, quite often, in terms of actually literally a booklet to take away, and they have opportunities to ask questions and things. But nevertheless, I don't think the message is getting through. And in terms, one of the problems with the care pathway is there's very little psychological support post-surgery. There tends to be psychological support pre-surgery, although that's not everywhere. Post-surgery it's very rare, and actually I would argue you need it more post-surgery than you do pre-surgery. And again, BOMS has brought out guidance that suggests that people should have more post-surgery, but there's a real lack of clinical psychologists generally in the UK, and particularly people who've got this sort of specialist interest and expertise. So I'm not quite sure how I'm going to manage that. So yeah, but in theory, people have all that information, but I don't think it's quite working as well as it should at the moment. And in terms of shared decision making, I think in general practice, I think GPs don't know very much about bariatric surgery. So at that stage, I suspect shared decision making isn't as good as it could be. And the tier 3 service, I would hope it's better because there is the expertise there and they should be able to give more information to people.
Amanda, I'll come to you, and I think we'll mark this as the final question. Sorry, Nick.
I'm happy for Nick to go in my place.
No, go on.
It was more of a comment, really. I think, there's a common discourse at the moment about the role of the GP, the role of the patient, and the role of specialist services, and trying to find an effective model for people with complexities. And I think it's got to be multifactorial. I mean, a lot more is done in general practice in, even this year than was done 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 40 years ago when I started. And I think the services, in my experience, that work best are the ones where specialist services retain some responsibility, not necessarily seeing the patient, but for checking that all the stuff's been done and contacting the patient, perhaps through a specialist nurse advisor or whatever, so that there's a safety net. We do the same from the practice. And of course, the 10 top tip stuff, Helen, and getting people's head round the very important material that you and colleagues have produced for us is really good model. And then also educating the patient where possible. The only other comment I have is about transitions, and that's a really big issue in lots of services, because it feels like a rejection to the patient when they've had very important contact. It's like, you're telling me I don't have to come anymore. I think we could be a bit smarter about those transitions to sort of enable people, even if we actually don't need to see them. And it runs a bit broader than just this one, but the psychology side, I think, is really an important toolkit for us in general practice and for the specialist colleagues too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's not just this area where there are issues.
If you think about Alcoholics Anonymous, people never stop going. The idea that you can be fixed in 2 years and then be left alone to your own devices is often a non-starter, really, isn't it?
And I think, I mean, there's a lot, as you say, we do in general practice, and we, a lot of the annual review for bariatric surgery it overlaps with other long-term conditions. So there's no reason why we couldn't do it in some ways. But particularly with the nutritional side, it does get quite complex quite quickly, and it's really outside our training. So we do need support from specialists in some way, or me, not quite sure what that's going to look like, but in somehow we need to have that sort of support.
Well, thanks ever so much, Helen, and thanks to John, who has had to depart. And we've only run slightly over time, which is pretty good going for this seminar series, I have to say. I am sure there are more seminars to come this year, but I wasn't asked to advertise the next one. So look out for the emails to come, I'm sure. And just thanks to everyone for participating. And we're nearly at the end of the school holidays, so it's normal working practices resume next week, I'm sure.